She built his empire. He brought home a replacement. The moment Damian Blackwell walked through those mansion doors with another woman on his arm, smiling, relaxed, utterly unbothered, every person in that dining room went completely still, not because they were surprised a man like Damian could do something like this, but because his wife was sitting right there. Evelyn Mercer Blackwell, who had quietly held this family together for 8 years, who had eaten every insult his mother threw at her like it was part of the meal, who had signed her name to documents that kept this empire breathing. She was right there, and he walked in anyway. The room waited for her to shatter. She didn't. If this story hit you somewhere deep, stay with me, like this video. Drop a comment with your city or country so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Evelyn does in the next 2 hours will change everything you thought you knew about silence, sacrifice, and who really holds the power in a room. What? The luncheon had been Margaret Blackwell's idea, as most Sunday rituals were. Margaret ran the family calendar the way she ran everything else, with the assumption that her preferences were the only ones that mattered, and that anyone who disagreed simply hadn't thought it through carefully enough. The invitation had gone out on Thursday. 12 people. The mansion in Westchester. 1 o'clock sharp. Evelyn had received the same printed card as everyone else, slipped under the door of her home office by the housekeeper, as if she were a guest and not the woman who paid the mortgage. She had gone anyway. That was the thing about Evelyn. She always went anyway. She arrived 20 minutes early because she knew Margaret would comment if she didn't, and she was tired of giving the woman ammunition. She helped carry platters from the kitchen because the new catering staff didn't know where the serving trays were stored. She smiled at Damian's younger brother, who was already halfway through a glass of white wine at 12:40 in the afternoon. She endured a brief sideways comment from Margaret about the weight she'd put on, not enough to constitute a real insult, just enough to land. And she let it pass the way she had learned to let everything pass, like water against stone, wearing her down so slowly nobody noticed. Damian was supposed to arrive by 1. He arrived at 1:18. Evelyn heard the front door before she saw him. She was in the dining room, adjusting a centerpiece that didn't need adjusting, when she caught the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the marble foyer, one heavy and confident, one lighter, quicker, the particular rhythm of heels on stone that didn't belong to anyone she recognized. She didn't move. She heard Margaret's voice shift, the careful, controlled pitch her mother-in-law used when something was happening that she hadn't approved but was deciding in real time whether to endorse. Then Damian's laugh, the social laugh, the one he deployed at corporate dinners when he was performing for a room, and then the sound of a woman's voice, warm and certain and completely unafraid. When Evelyn finally turned around, Damian was standing in the doorway of the dining room with his hand resting at the small of another woman's back. She was striking. That was the honest word for it. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She had the particular ease of someone who had never once in her adult life walked into a room and wondered whether she belonged there. She stood close to Damian, not aggressively, not performatively, just close, the way people stand when proximity has become a habit. Damian looked around the room the way he always did, measuring the audience before he spoke. "Everyone," he said, like he was opening a board meeting, "this is Celeste Vane. She'll be joining us today." That was it. That was the entire introduction. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the woman standing 12 feet away from him who wore his last name and had, for the past 8 years, organized every family event he'd attended, negotiated every financial crisis he'd floated through, and absorbed every sharp thing his family had ever said without once asking him to make it stop. He looked at Evelyn exactly once, briefly. The way you glance at a piece of furniture you've moved past so many times, it's become invisible. Then he guided Celeste Vane to a chair and pulled it out for her. The room was quiet. In that particular way, rooms get quiet when something terrible has just happened and everyone is waiting to see who moves first. Evelyn felt it, the stares, the held breath, the collective pause of 12 people bracing for an explosion. She felt the heat climb up the back of her neck. She felt the very specific physical sensation of being publicly humiliated in a room full of people who had watched her be quietly, incrementally humiliated for years and said nothing. She picked up her water glass. She took a sip. Her hand was steady. Margaret, to her credit or perhaps to her own survival instinct, attempted to redirect. She said something about the soup course, gestured toward the kitchen. Damien's brother sat very still and stared at the tablecloth. His wife caught Evelyn's eye for just a moment before looking away, which was about as much solidarity as Evelyn had ever gotten from that quarter. Celeste Vane settled into her chair and unfolded her napkin with the unhurried grace of someone who had absolutely no idea or absolutely no concern about what she had just walked into. Lunch proceeded. That was the thing that nobody who told this story later could quite believe. Lunch actually proceeded. Soup was served. A salad came out. People spoke about things that didn't matter. Damien was animated, talkative, pouring wine, and making the kind of broad, confident declarations he made whenever he wanted a room to pay attention to him. Celeste laughed at the right moments. Margaret asked her careful, vaguely pointed questions about her background, her family, her career, the kind of social forensics Margaret performed on everyone until she had filed them into the correct category. Evelyn ate her soup. She wasn't performing calm. She wasn't holding herself together by some extraordinary act of will. What was happening inside her was quieter and stranger than that. Something that had been accumulating for a very long time was simply completing its process. The way ice finishes forming, the way a fracture finally gives, not with a bang, but with a clean, precise snap. She had known. Not about Celeste specifically, not the name or the face or the dress, but she had known the way you know things you don't let yourself fully look at. In the texture of the last 2 years, in the trips that ran slightly long, in the particular quality of Damien's distance, which had shifted from distraction to absence so gradually she had almost convinced herself it was normal. She had known in the way her own financial attorney, Marcus Webb, had looked at her 6 months ago across a conference table and said, carefully, that it might be time to think about protective measures. And she had nodded and said she understood, and then not acted on it for 3 more months because acting on it would have made it real. She thought about Marcus now, about the conversation she'd finally had with him 8 weeks ago, about the documents he'd prepared, the arrangements he'd made, the envelope currently sitting in her bag, which she had brought to this luncheon, not because she had planned to use it today, but because she had started carrying it with her the way some people carry a phone, reflexively, for the moment when you need it. Dessert came out. Margaret made a comment about the tartness of the lemon curd being a personal failing of the new pastry chef. Damien agreed. Celeste smiled and said she found it lovely. This small, accidental moment of disagreement between Celeste and Margaret, this tiny, innocuous friction, seemed to clarify something for Margaret in real time, and Evelyn watched her mother-in-law perform the rapid internal calculation of a woman deciding whether this new arrival was an asset or a threat. Damien refilled Celeste's glass. He did not refill Evelyn's. It was such a small thing, the kind of thing you could explain away a dozen different ways. He hadn't noticed. The bottle was closer to Celeste's side. It didn't mean anything, and yet it sat inside Evelyn's chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt every ripple. She set her spoon down quietly. She reached into her bag. She did it without any particular ceremony, without announcement, without the dramatic pause that would have signaled to the room that something was coming. She simply reached into her bag and removed a thick manila envelope, rubber-banded, labeled, Marcus's firm name stamped in the upper left corner, and placed it on the table beside her plate. Then she slid her left hand across the linen tablecloth and removed, slowly and deliberately, her wedding ring. The sound it made when she set it down, that small, flat click of gold against the envelope, seemed to carry in the silence that had suddenly opened up around the table. She pushed both items across the cloth toward Damien. He was watching her now. They all were. Celeste had gone very still. Evelyn looked at her husband, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. And she said it quietly, without heat, without trembling, without a single word more than she meant. Then let her save your empire today. She stood up from her chair. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and out the front door of the Blackwell mansion without looking back once. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. What nobody at that table understood yet, what Damien himself would not understand for another 4 minutes, until his brother finally leaned across and pushed the envelope toward him, was that Evelyn Mercer Blackwell had not left empty-handed. She had left holding everything. The first thing that fell out of the envelope when Damien finally tore the rubber band off was a cover letter from Webb, Hartley and Associates, printed on formal letterhead, addressed to Damien's own legal team. It was 2 pages long. Damien read approximately the first 6 lines before his face changed. His brother watched him read. His brother was not a perceptive man in most respects, but he had grown up with Damien, and he knew what Damien looked like when something was actually wrong, as opposed to the elaborate performances of stress Damien produced when he wanted sympathy or leverage. This was the real thing. This was the face Damien made when the floor shifted. Margaret started to ask what was in the envelope. Damien didn't answer her. He read the letter again, slower this time. Then he set it down and began going through the documents beneath it. Methodically, page by page, hands not quite steady. Each page was another financial record, another set of signatures. 8 years of corporate guarantees, loan agreements, collateral arrangements, all of them bearing Evelyn Mercer's signature alongside the Blackwell Holdings corporate seal. Not Evelyn Blackwell. Evelyn Mercer. She had always signed her legal documents with her maiden name, a habit she'd maintained for professional reasons from the beginning of their marriage. Damien had found it mildly eccentric and never asked her to change it, partly because corporate paperwork bored him, and partly because he had never, not once in 8 years, read the documents carefully enough to understand what they actually said. What they said was this: nearly 40% of Blackwell Holdings' debt structure had been secured through personal guarantees made by Evelyn Mercer. Not the company, not Damien. Her. Her personal credit, her private assets, her signature as an individual rather than a corporate officer. It meant that if she withdrew those guarantees, which she had now legally done, per the notice attached to page 17, certain tranches of the company's loan arrangements would immediately become unstable. Banks would begin making calls. Lawyers would start moving. The careful financial architecture that kept Blackwell Holdings running would develop very quickly some very serious cracks. Celeste asked if something was wrong. Nobody answered her. Margaret had taken the cover letter from where Damien had set it down, and she was reading it with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to understand financial documents, because her late husband had taught her that people who didn't understand money were people who got taken advantage of. As she read, something complicated moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, because Margaret Blackwell was not a woman who did guilt in the conventional sense. Something more like recalculation. The rapid, uncomfortable process of revising a story she had been telling herself for a very long time. She had genuinely, fully believed, that her son ran his company, that the Blackwell name and Damien's considerable intelligence and the legacy her husband had built were the structural pillars of everything. She had believed Evelyn was decorative, a capable enough woman, certainly, but a wife, a background figure, someone who managed the household and attended the events and served a social function without contributing to anything that actually mattered. She set the letter down. She said nothing. Damien was already on his phone. He had stepped away from the table and was standing near the window, speaking in a low, urgent voice that Evelyn would have recognized immediately. It was the voice he used when things were going wrong and he needed someone else to fix them. But the person he was calling was Marcus Webb's office. And Marcus Webb no longer worked for Blackwell Holdings. He had resigned that account, per standard professional ethics protocols, 8 weeks ago when he had taken on Evelyn Mercer as a personal client. The call went to voicemail. Damien stood at the window for a long moment with his phone pressed against his ear, listening to a recorded voice explain that the office was closed on Sundays and to please call back during business hours. Outside in the long driveway, Evelyn Mercer's car had already turned the corner and disappeared. She drove for almost 40 minutes before she stopped. Not because she was lost, she knew exactly where she was going, but because somewhere around the 20-minute mark on the Hutchinson, the thing she had been holding in finally reached the end of what she could contain. She pulled off at a rest stop, parked in the far corner of the lot away from the other cars, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel and let herself feel it. It was not what she expected. She had been braced for grief, or rage, or the specific dull agony of humiliation absorbed in front of an audience. What came instead was something closer to exhaustion, an enormous cellular tiredness that seemed to go all the way down, the weight of 8 years of careful management, of calibrated restraint, of being the person who held the shape of something that didn't deserve the holding. She had loved him. That was the part that nobody would probably believe later, when the story settled into the version that made sense. But she had. Not perfectly, not without reservation, not without the slow erosion of something that maybe should have been addressed 4 years ago, or 3, or 2. But she had loved him the way you love something that cost you a great deal, not wisely and not well, and absolutely. She allowed herself exactly 12 minutes. She knew this because she looked at the clock when she pulled off, and she looked at it again when she started the engine. 12 minutes of sitting in a rest stop parking lot on a Sunday afternoon with her forehead against the steering wheel, letting whatever needed to come out, come out. Then she wiped her face. She checked her mirrors. She pulled back onto the highway. She had a meeting with Marcus at 9 o'clock Monday morning. There was a great deal of work still to do. The ring was still on the table at the Blackwell mansion. She did not go back for it. She had never particularly liked the setting anyway. What? By 6 o'clock Sunday evening, Damien had made 14 phone calls. By 8 o'clock, he had confirmation from the company's CFO that the notification from Webb, Hartley and Associates had already been received by 2 of their primary lending institutions. One had already responded with a request for clarification regarding the status of the personal guarantee arrangements. The language was careful, professional, and completely unambiguous in what it implied. By 10 o'clock, Damien was sitting in his home office. Not the mansion, his own home, which felt strange and too quiet in a way it hadn't felt in years. With a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking, trying to build a timeline of every financial decision the company had made in the past 8 years, and locate, in that timeline, the exact moments when Evelyn had stepped in. There were more of them than he had realized, many more. He sat there for a long time. At 11:43 he called her cell phone. She didn't answer. She was asleep. It was the first night in 3 years she had gone to bed before midnight, and she slept so thoroughly that she didn't hear her phone ring, didn't hear it ring again at 12:15, didn't hear the third call at 1 in the morning. In the morning, she would see 3 missed calls from Damien, 2 from Margaret, and 1 from his brother, which surprised her. She hadn't thought Damien's brother paid enough attention to current events to weigh in this quickly. She would pour herself a cup of coffee. She would sit at the kitchen table in the apartment she had quietly rented 6 weeks ago, the one nobody in the Blackwell family knew existed yet. She would look out the window at the city waking up below her. And then she would get ready for her meeting with Marcus, because the day was going to be long and complicated, and she intended to be ready for all of it. The ring was still at the mansion. The empire was already cracking. And Evelyn Mercer, not Blackwell, never again Blackwell, was only just beginning. Marcus Webb had a particular way of sitting in silence that most people found unsettling. He didn't fidget. He didn't fill the air with reassurances. He simply waited, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on whoever was speaking, until the other person had said everything they needed to say and there was nothing left to cover up with noise. It was the quality that had made him an exceptional attorney for 23 years. And it was the quality that had made Evelyn trust him when she'd walked into his office 8 weeks ago and told him she needed to protect herself from her own life. Monday morning, 9:14. The conference room at Webb, Hartley and Associates smelled like coffee and old leather and the particular antiseptic chill of central air conditioning running too cold in September. Evelyn sat across from Marcus with both hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone lukewarm and a yellow legal pad in front of her that she hadn't written anything on yet. Marcus said, "Walk me through yesterday." She did. She kept it factual, the way he'd taught her. Not because she was suppressing anything, but because she had discovered over the past 8 weeks that factual was the version that made her feel most in control of her own story. She told him about the luncheon, the timing of Damien's arrival, the woman's name, the dining room, the ring, the envelope. She told him what she'd said and how she'd said it. Marcus listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "How many calls?" 6. Between 11 and 1 in the morning, I was asleep for all of them. Did you listen to the voicemails? 3 of them were hang-ups. Damien left one message. He said, she paused, took a breath, because even factual had its textures. He said he needed to speak with me urgently about a misunderstanding. Marcus's expression didn't change. A misunderstanding. That was the word he used. Did Margaret call? Once. No message. His brother? 1 call, no message. Which surprised me. Marcus wrote something on his own pad. Don't call any of them back without me on the line. Not even Thomas. Thomas was Damien's brother, mild wine-drinking Thomas, who had never done anything particularly harmful to Evelyn, but had also never done anything particularly useful. Has your phone rung this morning? Twice before I got here. Unknown numbers. I didn't answer. Marcus nodded slowly. That would be their legal team. They moved fast. He said it without admiration, simply as data. We expected this. The notification hit First Coastal and Meridian Capital on Friday after close, so they had the weekend to sit with it and Monday morning to panic. Blackwell Holdings attorneys will have been called Saturday night. Evelyn looked at her lukewarm coffee. How bad is it for them? Marcus set his pen down. Evelyn, that's not the right question for you to be asking right now. She looked up. The right question, he said, is how protected are you? And the answer is very. Completely, if you follow the process we've mapped out and you don't deviate from it based on anything Damien says to you. She nodded. She had known this. She needed to hear it out loud. He's going to contact you, Marcus said. Probably today. In person, if he can manage it. He's going to tell you this can all be resolved quietly, that you're creating a crisis where there doesn't need to be one, that if you just come back to the table, everything can be worked out. He paused. He's going to be very convincing. I know. I know you know. I'm telling you anyway. What? Damien arrived at Marcus's office building at 11:20, which meant he had hired someone to find out where Evelyn was meeting this morning, which meant he had made that call sometime before 9 a.m., which told Evelyn something about the state of his sleep the previous night. She was in the lobby, waiting for an elevator, when he walked through the glass doors. He looked terrible. Not disheveled. Damien Blackwell did not do disheveled. Some combination of discipline and vanity made even his worst moments presentable. But there was a tightness around his eyes that she recognized as the specific look of a man who had been awake since 2 a.m. rehearsing conversations in his head. His suit was correct. His hair was right. Everything was correct except the eyes. He said her name. She turned around. She had known he was coming. Marcus had texted her 40 seconds ago when the building's front desk called up, so she had the small advantage of having already decided how to hold her face. I need 5 minutes, he said. You need to make an appointment through my attorney. Evelyn. He said her name differently that time. Quieter. Stripped of the performance. Please. The elevator arrived. She stepped into it. He followed. She let him follow because she was going up 2 floors to Marcus's office, and having the conversation in an elevator with a finite ride time was safer than having it in the lobby where it could expand. She pressed 2. The doors closed. What you did yesterday, he started. What I did, she said, was remove my ring and hand you a legal notice. In that order. In front of my entire family. In front of your family and your mistress. Yes. Her voice was level, flat. She had practiced level and flat extensively in the past 6 weeks. If you were concerned about the venue, you had control over that. He put his hand out, not grabbing, just placing it on the wall beside her, close enough to establish something, proximity or urgency, or the physical grammar of a man who was used to his size mattering in conversations. I need you to call Webb and tell him to pause the notifications. No. Evelyn, you don't understand what's happening on the lending side. I understand exactly what's happening on the lending side. She turned to look at him directly. I've understood the lending structure of Blackwell Holdings for 7 years. Better than your CFO. Certainly better than you. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. She walked out. He followed her into the hallway and she heard his breathing. Sharp, controlled, the breathing of a man holding himself together at significant cost. And she kept walking. I'm not doing this in the hall, she said, without turning around. Then where? Nowhere. Not today. Call Gerald Kim and have Gerald Kim call Marcus. That's the process. Gerald Kim doesn't know what I need to say to you. She stopped. She turned. He was 3 feet behind her, and in the fluorescent light of the office corridor, he looked for just a moment genuinely undone. Not performing it, not deploying it strategically, but actually standing in the wreckage of something and not knowing how to move. She almost felt it. The old reflex. 8 years of caring about this man, even the wrong version of him, didn't evaporate in 48 hours. Damien. Her voice was not cruel. It was not warm either. It was the tone of a doctor delivering results. Whatever you need to say to me as a husband, you should have said before yesterday. Whatever you need to say to me as a business partner, say it to Marcus. She walked into Marcus's office. The receptionist locked the door behind her. In the hallway, for 3 full minutes, Damien didn't move. The collapse, when it began to happen publicly, moved faster than even Marcus had projected. By Tuesday afternoon, the financial press had picked up on unusual activity in Blackwell Holdings' lending arrangements. Nothing specific. Nobody had leaked the documents yet. The story was still assembling itself from data points and whisper networks. But the stock movement was visible to anyone watching. A drop of 4.5% by close of Tuesday. Small enough that a PR team could manage it. Large enough that every institutional investor who held Blackwell stock had made at least one phone call by end of day. Wednesday morning, a business journalist named Priya Sood published a piece in a financial publication under the headline, "Blackwell Holdings Faces Unusual Lending Questions Amid Reported Executive Changes." The piece was careful, sourced only to unnamed people familiar with the matter, and said almost nothing specific. It didn't need to. The phrase "reported executive changes" was enough to send the stock down another 6 points before noon. Evelyn read the article on her laptop in the apartment nobody knew about. She was in her bathrobe, eating toast over the sink because she still hadn't bought a kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she sent Marcus a text that said simply, "Priya Sood. Did we know her?" Marcus replied within 2 minutes, "Not us. Someone inside the company." Then, after a pause, "Could be useful." She set her phone face down on the counter and finished her toast. The Blackwell family meeting happened on Wednesday evening in the sitting room of the Westchester mansion, and it was, by every account Evelyn received later, through the particular intelligence network that formed when people who'd witnessed something wanted someone to know they'd witnessed it, catastrophic. Damien sat at one end of the room. Margaret sat at the other. Thomas sat in the middle in the posture of a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else. There were 2 attorneys present, Gerald Kim from Blackwell's corporate team, and a woman named Carol Voss, whom Margaret had retained independently and without telling Damien, which was the first indication of the evening that Margaret had begun to separate her interests from her son's. The second indication was when Margaret spoke first. "I want to understand," she said, "exactly how much of this company was operating on Evelyn's guarantees without my knowledge." Damien looked at Gerald Kim. Gerald Kim looked at the floor. "That's not a simple question," Damien said. "It's a yes or no question preceded by a number," Margaret said. "Give me the number." Gerald Kim said quietly that the current exposure across guaranteed arrangements was approximately $230 million in secured instruments that were now in technical review. The room was quiet. Thomas poured himself something from the decanter on the side table. Nobody told him to stop. Margaret said, $230 million of this company's stability was guaranteed personally by my daughter-in-law, and I am only learning this on Wednesday. The arrangements were, Damien started. Where were you, Margaret said, cutting across him with the precision of a woman who had been cutting across people for 68 years, when these papers were being signed? Damien didn't answer. Were you aware that her personal assets were being used as collateral? Silence. Damien. I was aware that Evelyn was involved in certain financing structures, yes. Involved. Margaret repeated the word the way you repeat a word when you want everyone in the room to hear how inadequate it is. She was the foundation, and you brought another woman into this house and put her at my dining room table while the foundation watched. That's not relevant to the financial. It is extremely relevant. Margaret's voice had not risen. It hadn't needed to. Because whatever Evelyn's legal options are right now, whatever she has decided to do or not do with those guarantees, she made those decisions as a woman who was publicly humiliated in front of this family, and you handed her every piece of leverage she needed while you were busy not paying attention. Thomas said very quietly, into his drink. She did say that, Damien. She said it right to your face, and you didn't open the envelope for 4 minutes. Damien turned on his brother with a look that shut him down immediately. Carol Voss, Margaret's attorney, opened her briefcase and placed a single document on the coffee table. She said, Mrs. Blackwell has asked me to explore the legal separation of her personal holdings from the Blackwell Holdings corporate structure, effective immediately. Damien stared at his mother. Margaret looked back at him without blinking. I love you, she said. You are also going to fix this yourself. I am not going to lose what your father built because you couldn't see what was in front of you. Gerald Kim started to object on procedural grounds, and Margaret talked directly over him as if he hadn't spoken at all. Damien left the meeting at 9:15. He sat in his car in the driveway for 11 minutes before he could make himself drive. Celeste Vane called him Thursday morning to say she thought it would be better, given everything, if they gave each other some space. She said it kindly. She said it with the careful vocabulary of a person who wanted to be decent about something she had already decided. She said she hoped he understood. Damien said he understood. After he hung up, he sat with his phone in his hand for a while. He didn't feel the specific grief he might have expected. What he felt was something closer to the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes when you've lost enough things quickly enough that you stop being able to pretend any of it is recoverable through charm. He called Evelyn's number. She didn't answer. He had stopped leaving voicemails 2 days ago because he'd realized, after 6 of them, that the voicemails were for him, not for her. They were the verbal equivalent of standing in an empty room and insisting someone was still in it. He opened his email instead and typed, "I need you to know that I understand now what you did for this company, what you did for me. I'm asking you to come back to the table, not for the marriage, for the employees, for the people who will lose jobs if this goes further." He read it back. He deleted the last sentence, then typed it again, then deleted it again. He sent what was left. Evelyn read the email at 2:17 in the afternoon. She forwarded it to Marcus without responding. Marcus called her 6 minutes later. "He's pivoting to the employees." "I know. It won't work." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it true, though? About the jobs?" "There are ways to stabilize the company that don't require you to walk back into that marriage, Evelyn. You know that." "I'm not walking back into anything. I'm asking about the employees." Marcus was quiet. Then, "About 2,000 would be at elevated risk if the lending arrangements collapse completely and the company can't restructure." "But Evelyn, that scenario assumes you do nothing. It assumes no restructuring proposal, no negotiation, no alternative path. It's the worst case if everyone acts in the worst possible way." She said, "Then we need to make sure they don't." The first face-to-face meeting between Evelyn's legal team and Blackwell Holdings attorneys happened Friday at 11 in a conference room on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown that had no association with either party. Neutral ground, Marcus's insistence. Evelyn was not in the meeting. This was deliberate. She sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away with her laptop open and a phone on the table in front of her, and Marcus called her at 40-minute intervals to report. Gerald Kim was there for Blackwell. A woman named Sandra Park, who handled restructuring, was there for the lending institutions. Marcus had brought an associate named Derek Chen, who specialized in collateral arrangements. The first call, at 11:40, Marcus said, "They want to talk about cure periods. They're not ready to negotiate the underlying structure yet." "How long a cure period are they proposing?" 90 days. "Tell them 60. At 12:20, Sandra Park wants to see the full schedule of guaranteed instruments. She already has it. Webb sent it Thursday. She wants confirmation directly from you. She can have Marcus confirm. My signature is not going on anything in a conference room I'm not in." At 1:05, Marcus's voice was different. She could hear it before he said a word. The particular quality of careful that meant something had come up that wasn't on the prepared list. "Marcus." Gerald Kim brought something to the table, a supplemental schedule. "What kind of supplemental schedule?" Brief pause. "Instruments you didn't know about." The noise in the coffee shop continued around her. The grinder, the register, someone laughing near the door. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Marcus said slowly, "that there are guarantee documents bearing your signature that were not part of the original package we reviewed. Gerald is representing that these were executed in good faith as part of routine financing operations." Her hand on the table was very still. "I never signed anything I wasn't shown. I know." "Marcus?" "I know, Evelyn. I'm looking at them right now." His voice was careful in the way that meant he was choosing every word. "They're your signature. The dates are real. The notarization looks valid." He stopped. "But the instruments they're securing, these aren't Blackwell Holdings standard lending arrangements." She waited. "They're collateral structures for a series of subsidiary accounts, accounts that don't appear in any of the company's public filings." The coffee shop kept making its noise, the grinder, the register, the laugh. How much? She said. Marcus said the number. She closed her laptop. She sat very still, because the number Marcus said was not $230 million. The number Marcus said was substantially, catastrophically larger. And the accounts it secured were not Blackwell Holdings accounts. They were something else entirely. And Evelyn Mercer's name was on all of them. Marcus called back 9 minutes after the first call ended. Evelyn was still sitting at the same table in the same coffee shop, but she had moved her laptop to the side, and her untouched coffee was cold, and she was staring at a fixed point on the wall across from her with the particular stillness of a person whose mind is moving very fast while her body has gone completely quiet. I need you to come in, Marcus said. Tell me the rest first. Evelyn, tell me the rest and then I'll come in. He exhaled. She heard papers shifting, the sound of him closing a door. The subsidiary accounts are structured as independent LLCs, 7 of them registered in Delaware, 2 in Nevada. They're not on any Blackwell Holdings filing because they're not technically Blackwell Holdings entities. They have their own boards, their own EINs, their own banking relationships. But they're connected to Blackwell. The money flow connects them, not the paperwork. And my signatures are on the collateral arrangements for all 7. 6 of the 7. The 7th uses a different structure. We're still looking at it. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. Outside the coffee shop window, a delivery truck was double parked, and a cab driver was leaning on his horn in the particular rhythm of someone who had already given up expecting results. Marcus, when were these documents dated? The earliest is 4 years ago. The most recent... He stopped. When? 8 months ago. 8 months ago, she had been in the marriage, still signing things Damien put in front of her, still trusting that the documents were what they were described as: routine corporate housekeeping, financing renewals, instruments she reviewed in the broad strokes because the detailed review was supposedly handled by the company's legal team, which she had believed meant it had been handled, vetted, checked. She had been careful. She had always been careful. But careful, she was understanding now, had not been careful enough. I need to know, she said, if there is any scenario in which I signed these documents knowingly. Silence. Marcus. No, he said. Based on everything I know about you and everything I've seen in 8 weeks of reviewing your financial history, no. But I need you to hear me say the next part clearly. It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is what a forensic auditor can prove, and what a federal investigator will conclude when they look at your signature on documents securing shell company debt and ask themselves whether a woman of your financial sophistication could have not known what she was signing. The cab outside had stopped honking. The truck had moved. The coffee shop was filling up with the lunch crowd, and someone bumped the back of Evelyn's chair without apologizing, and she sat through all of it without moving. Someone forged context, she said slowly. They didn't forge my signature. They put real documents in front of me with false descriptions and had me sign them in good faith. That's my working theory. Which means someone with access to the signing process. Someone who knew when I was signing what else was in the stack, how to make one document look like another. Yes. That's not Damien alone, she said. Damien doesn't do paperwork. Damien has never in 8 years of marriage sat down and organized a document stack. He wouldn't know how to... She stopped. She was quiet for 4 full seconds. Who ran the internal signing process for corporate financing documents? Marcus said, "That's what I need you to come in to discuss." She was already closing her bag. His name was Lawrence Greer, and Evelyn had met him perhaps a dozen times. He was the Chief Financial Operations Officer of Blackwell Holdings, not the CFO, who was a public-facing role with board visibility, but the layer beneath that, the operational architecture, the man who controlled the internal flow of financial documents, the signing schedules, the compliance calendar. He had been with the company for 11 years. He was 54, gray at the temples, the kind of man who wore the same brand of suit in 3 different colors, and whose handshake was always slightly too firm in the way of someone who had decided years ago that firmness was a form of credibility. Evelyn had never liked him. She had never been able to articulate why to anyone's satisfaction, including her own. There was nothing specific to point to. He was professionally correct, technically competent, unfailingly polite when she was in the room. But there was something in the quality of his attention when she was present at executive meetings, something in the way he managed information flow that had always registered to her as off-center. She had mentioned it to Damien once, 3 years ago. Damien had said she was being intuitive in a way that wasn't useful. He had said this with the particular tone he used when he meant that she was being a woman about something in a room where being a woman wasn't considered a method of analysis. She had let it go. She was sitting in Marcus's conference room now, not the coffee shop, the documents spread across the table between her and Marcus and Derek Chen, and she was looking at the name Lawrence Greer on an internal routing slip attached to the back of the first fraudulent guarantee document, and she was thinking about how much she had let go over 8 years and what the aggregate cost of all that letting go had turned out to be. He routed every document, Derek said. He was young, 31, maybe 32, and he was good at reading financial structures, the way some people are good at reading music, hearing patterns in data that other people experienced as noise. Every single one in this stack came through his office before it reached Mrs. Mercer's signing queue. That's not unusual for his role. But the gap between the document description logged in the routing system and the actual instrument content, that's consistent. Somebody cleaned up the descriptions before logging, made them look like routine renewal instruments. Can you prove it was him? Evelyn said. Not yet. We can prove the routing path. We can prove the description discrepancy. Whether someone directed him to do this or he acted independently, that's going to take more. How much more? Weeks. Maybe more. She felt the word land on her like a physical weight. Weeks. She had been thinking in days. She had been thinking that the problem in front of her was the existing guaranteed instruments, the $230 million they already knew about, and that the task was negotiating those down, restructuring the lending arrangements, extracting her name from the corporate architecture cleanly enough to move forward. Now there was a different problem. Now there were 6 shell company collateral arrangements bearing her signature, and a routing trail that led to Lawrence Greer, and a total exposure that Marcus had quoted to her in the coffee shop, and that she was still not fully letting herself think about directly. What happens, she said, if a federal authority sees these documents before we have an explanation for them? Marcus and Derek exchanged a look. Tell me. Marcus said, the most charitable reading of what's in front of us is that you were the victim of an internal document fraud scheme. The least charitable reading is that you were the knowing principal on a series of shell company financing arrangements that may constitute wire fraud, securities fraud, and potentially tax evasion. He said it flat, factual. The way he always delivered things she needed to hear. The least charitable reading is not accurate, but Evelyn, it is available. It is sitting right there, and anyone who wants to use it can pick it up. She looked at the documents on the table. Her name, her signature, notarized, dated, formatted correctly in every particular, perfectly real. Who benefits, she said, if I go down for this? Nobody answered immediately. If I'm the one holding the bag on 6 shell company collateral arrangements and I'm the one facing federal exposure, who benefits? Not Damien. Damien's messy, but he's not organized enough to engineer something this layered. She was talking partly to them and partly to herself, working it out the way she worked through financial structures, looking for where the flow actually went. Greer has been there 11 years. He has relationships with the lending institutions. He knows the compliance calendar. He controls document flow. But Greer isn't wealthy. Greer doesn't have the kind of access that would make him the architect. She stopped. She looked at Marcus. Who does Greer report to? Formally, the CFO. And the CFO reports to the board. Yes. Is there a board member with a direct financial relationship to any of the lending institutions that hold these shell company instruments? Derek was already pulling something up on his laptop. He typed for 45 seconds. Then he stopped typing and looked at the screen and said quietly, Raymond Holt. Raymond Holt was the longest-serving member of the Blackwell Holdings Board of Directors. He was 71 years old. He had known Damien's father. He had a philanthropic foundation, a reputation in the business community that was essentially unassailable, and a private equity firm that had, according to what Derek was now reading off his screen, a 17% equity position in 2 of the Delaware LLCs that appeared in the shell company documents. He's inside the instruments, Derek said. He's not just inside them, Evelyn said. He put them there. She drove back to her apartment that evening in a state that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but something that contained elements of both, and sat below them, pressing up. She kept both hands on the wheel, and she kept her speed exactly at the limit, because the one thing she could not afford right now was to be stopped by anyone for any reason, And that awareness, the new grinding consciousness of being a person who had to be careful in ways she had never previously had to be careful, was itself a kind of rage. She had built nothing criminal. She had signed documents in good faith. She had been used as a legal shield by men who had decided, at some point around 4 years ago, that her name and her credibility and her personal financial history made her the perfect piece of architecture for something that could not afford to have their names on it. They had used her the way you use a load-bearing wall, invisibly, without asking, with the full expectation that she would hold up whatever they needed her to hold. She had held. She had held for 4 years without knowing what she was holding. Now the wall knew, and the wall was done. The call came at 8:47 that evening. She almost didn't answer. It was a number she didn't recognize, a 646 area code, and she had been not answering unknown numbers all week. But something made her pick up. Later, she would not be able to explain what. The voice on the other end was a woman's, measured, careful, slightly formal, with the specific diction of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was reading from a mental script to keep themselves from going off it. "Mrs. Mercer, my name is Nina Greer." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Lawrence Greer's wife." "Yes." A breath. "I need to speak with you. In person. Tonight, if you're willing. I know that's unusual. I know you have no reason to trust me." Another breath, shorter. "I have documents. Physical copies, not digital. I've had them for 6 weeks and I didn't know what to do with them, and then I read the thing in the financial press on Wednesday, and I understood that I had run out of time." Evelyn sat very still on the edge of her bed with her phone pressed to her ear and the apartment quiet around her. "What kind of documents?" she said. "Emails. Between my husband and Raymond Holt. Printed, because Lawrence prints everything, he doesn't trust servers. He said that once and I thought it was paranoia, but he printed the emails and he kept them at home in a locked drawer in his study. And I found them when I was looking for the insurance documents after our daughter's car accident in April." Her voice caught slightly on the word daughter. She brought it back. "I have read them many times. I know what they mean. And Mrs. Mercer, they talk about you by name. They talk about what to do if you ever—" She stopped. "They have a plan. For if everything collapsed, there is a specific plan, written down, for how to make it look like it was you." The apartment was very quiet. "Send me your address," Evelyn said. "I'll be there in an hour." Nina Greer lived in a brownstone in Park Slope that had window boxes with dead plants in them and a front step with a crack running through the middle that nobody had gotten around to fixing. She opened the door before Evelyn knocked, which meant she had been watching from the window, which meant she was frightened. She was 50-something, dark-haired, gone significantly gray, with the look of a woman who had been attractive and energetic and had spent the last 6 months not sleeping. She was wearing a cardigan over a work blouse as if she'd come home and partially changed, and then stopped because something had interrupted the routine. Her hands, when she held the door open, were not steady. She led Evelyn through a hallway to the kitchen without saying anything. There was a manila folder on the kitchen table. She sat down across from it. She did not touch it. Evelyn sat down. She looked at the folder. She did not touch it either. "How long have you known," Evelyn said, "that Lawrence was doing something illegal?" Nina looked at the table. "I knew something was wrong for about 2 years. The way he talked about certain people, the way he came home sometimes. I didn't know the shape of it." She looked up. "I didn't know your name was in it until I read those emails." "Did you confront him?" "I tried. He said I was misreading internal corporate communications and that if I raised this to anyone, it would destroy our family." She said it without particular emotion, the flat recitation of something that had been replayed enough times it had lost its surface texture. He said it very calmly. Lawrence is always calm. That's the thing about him. He never raises his voice. He just makes you understand that there are consequences, and he is very specific about what the consequences are. Evelyn understood something about that. Not Lawrence Greer specifically, but the mechanism. She reached out and opened the folder. There were 23 printed emails. She read them in order. It took her 17 minutes, and she read each one carefully, tracking names, dates, the specific language used in the way you track language when you're looking for the architecture of intent. By the 3rd email, she understood the basic structure. By the 8th, she understood that Raymond Holt had been the designer and Lawrence Greer the executor, and that Damien had been told enough to not ask questions while being kept carefully ignorant of the specific details that would make him culpable rather than merely negligent. By the 14th, she found her own name for the first time. Mercer's exposure can be established retroactively through the routing records if needed, Greer had written. She assigned everything placed in front of her without independent review. The documentation is clean. And she sat with that sentence for longer than she sat with any of the others. She had signed everything placed in front of her without independent review. He had written it like a vulnerability. He had used it like a weapon. By the 23rd email, she had a clear picture of the plan they had built for the scenario in which things went wrong. It was precise. It was layered. It pointed to her financial sophistication as evidence of knowing participation, to her signature on every document as evidence of control, to her quiet maintenance of the corporate structure as evidence of complicity rather than loyalty. It was, she had to acknowledge to herself with the cold, specific honesty that the situation required, a very good plan. If you didn't know her, if you came to these documents as a federal investigator with no context, no history, only the paper record, it was the kind of plan that would have worked. She closed the folder. She looked at Nina Greer. "Why are you giving me this?" she said. Nina was quiet for a moment. "Because my daughter was in that car accident and she's fine, she's completely fine, but for about 6 hours I didn't know that. And I sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours thinking about what it would mean if she wasn't fine, and what I would want to have done differently, and what kind of person I was for knowing what I knew and sitting on it." She pressed her lips together. "And I decided I couldn't be that person anymore." Evelyn looked at her. Nina Greer, who had been living in the same house as something wrong for 2 years and had been too frightened to move against it, was now sitting at her own kitchen table at 9:30 on a Monday night, handing that wrong thing to a woman she had never met. "You understand," Evelyn said carefully, "that once I take this to my attorney, Lawrence will know. There will be no version of this that protects him." "I know. And you're prepared for that." Nina looked at the dead plants in the window box. The light from the kitchen made them visible in the dark glass. Brown stems, dried soil, the remnants of something that had been alive and hadn't been tended to in time. "My husband made a choice," she said. "He made it without telling me, and he kept making it for 4 years. I'm not responsible for his choices." She paused. "I'm only responsible for mine." Evelyn picked up the folder. She stood up. She said, "I'm going to need you to be willing to speak to my attorney, possibly to federal authorities." "I know. It won't be comfortable." "I'm already uncomfortable," Nina said. "I've been uncomfortable for 2 years. At least now it's going somewhere." She called Marcus from the car outside the brownstone. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she had. He was quiet for a full 5 seconds, which was the longest she had ever heard Marcus Webb be quiet. And then he said, "Don't put that folder down. Don't photograph it. Don't email it. Bring it directly to me. I'm leaving now." "Evelyn." His voice had shifted, something careful and serious underneath the professional tone. "What they built, with your name, with the shell companies, with the routing, that's not just corporate fraud. The scale of it, the structure of it, the way federal statutes apply. I know. This is the kind of case that the DOJ takes personally. I know, Marcus. Which means the only way forward for you, the only way you walk out of this without your name attached to a federal investigation as a subject rather than a witness, is if you get there first." The street outside the brownstone was quiet. A dog walker crossed the end of the block. A window in the building across the street went dark. "Then that's what we do," she said. "Evelyn, if we do this, if we take this to federal authorities voluntarily, there is no version of that conversation that doesn't end with Damien Blackwell in a room with federal agents. Whatever was between you, whatever you still feel or don't feel, that ends every possibility of anything else." She thought about the dining room on Sunday, the ring on the white linen, the sound of her own voice saying 7 words to a man who had already stopped hearing her. She thought about Lawrence Greer writing that she had signed everything without independent review, as if that were a character flaw rather than the specific consequence of trusting people who did not deserve it. She thought about 8 years of Sunday lunches and silent corrections in financial documents, and the particular quality of invisibility that comes not from being unseen but from being seen and then deliberately looked past. "Drive to my office," Marcus said. "I'll be there when you arrive." She started the car. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside her. 23 emails. The architecture of a plan that had been designed to destroy her, and she drove through the dark streets of Brooklyn toward the bridge with her hands steady on the wheel, and something that had been Evelyn Mercer Blackwell, patient, careful, contained, the woman who absorbed and managed and signed and endured, was finishing its last few minutes of existing. What was replacing it didn't have a name yet, but it was not afraid, and it was not finished, and it was heading toward the bridge with a folder full of evidence and a phone call left to make that would change the shape of everything that came after. Marcus was already in the conference room when she arrived. It was 11:14 at night, and the office building was mostly dark, the elevator running on its after-hours cycle, the lobby's security guard who buzzed her in barely looking up from his phone. The 34th floor was lit only in the corridor leading to the Webb, Hartley suite. And when Evelyn pushed through the glass doors, she found Marcus standing at the head of the conference table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and 3 legal pads already covered in handwriting, which told her he had not been idle during the 47 minutes it had taken her to cross the bridge and find parking. Derek Chen was there too, at the side table with 2 laptops open, and a woman Evelyn hadn't met before. Mid-40s, sharp-faced, wearing a blazer over a running top as if she'd been pulled from something physical, who stood up when Evelyn walked in and said, "Helen Marsh, I'm a federal whistleblower specialist. Marcus called me 40 minutes ago." Evelyn set the folder on the table. She looked at Marcus. "I called her before you called me," he said. "I was already moving in this direction based on the Shell Company exposure. What you have in that folder," he nodded toward it, "determines how fast we move and how we frame your position." Helen Marsh picked up the folder without ceremony and began reading. She read the way lawyers read, fast and flat, not reacting to the content but cataloging it, filing it into the relevant structural categories. She turned pages steadily. Nobody talked. Evelyn sat down. She was aware of a specific tiredness that had settled into her shoulders and the base of her neck. Sometime in the last 2 hours, the kind that was not going to be resolved by sleep because it was not sleep tiredness. It was the accumulated weight of understanding things you couldn't ununderstand, carrying them without a place to put them down. Derek set a mug of coffee in front of her without being asked. She drank half of it before she registered the temperature. Helen Marsh finished the last page, closed the folder, and set it back on the table. She looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. "How did you get these?" "The wife of the man named in them." "Nina Greer?" "Yes." "Is she willing to cooperate?" "She said she was. I told her she'd need to speak to federal authorities. She understands what that means for her husband?" "She said she understood." Evelyn paused. "I believed her." Helen Marsh nodded once. She turned to Marcus. "We need to be in front of this by Friday, ideally Thursday." She turned back to Evelyn. "Here's the landscape. What you have in that folder, combined with the routing documentation Derek has already assembled, gives us a credible voluntary disclosure package. You walk into the Southern District with this material, you walk in with your attorney, you walk in as a witness and a victim of document fraud, not as a subject. But that window closes the moment anyone else presents this material first. If Holt's people figure out that Nina Greer has been talking, if Greer himself discovers his wife has removed documents from their home, if anyone on the Blackwell legal team puts together the Shell Company structure and goes to the DOJ first with a version of events that preempts yours, then I'm the subject," Evelyn said. "Then you're potentially the subject, yes." Helen's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who dealt in the actual shapes of things rather than the comfortable versions. Your financial sophistication is a double-edged fact. It makes the victim narrative coherent. You were valuable to them precisely because your credibility was above question. But it also gives a motivated prosecutor something to work with if the framing goes the other way. Evelyn looked at the folder. 23 emails, 4 years of architecture. Her name used as a wall to hide behind. "What do we need to do? What do we need to do?" she said. "And when do we need to do it?" Marcus sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. "Tonight we organize the package. Derek builds the document chain, routing records, description discrepancies, timeline of the Shell Company instrument creation. You write a statement of facts in your own words, describing every document you signed that is now implicated, the circumstances under which you signed it, what you were told it was, and what you have since learned it actually was." He paused. "This will take most of the night." "Okay." In the morning, I contact the U.S. Attorney's Office to arrange a voluntary disclosure meeting. We request Thursday. We present the full package: your statement, Derek's chain of evidence, the Greer emails, Nina Greer's contact information, and preliminary account. He looked at her steadily. And Evelyn, when we walk into that meeting, your marriage is a fact and evidence. Damien's conduct, his awareness, his relationship to Holt, his degree of knowledge about the shell structure, all of it becomes material. He will be investigated. I know. I want to be certain you've heard it. She looked at him. Marcus, I heard it. I've made the decision. She picked up a pen from the table. She pulled one of the blank legal pads toward her. Tell me how to format the statement of facts. She finished the statement at 4:17 in the morning. 11 pages, handwritten, then typed by Derek and printed. She read the printed version twice and corrected 3 factual details, and signed the bottom of the last page with the signature that had been used against her and was now being turned around. Helen Marsh had left at 2 and returned at 3:40 with 2 other people from her firm who sat up at the side table and began organizing the disclosure package with the focused efficiency of people who had done this before. Marcus had ordered food at some point. There were sandwich containers on the credenza that nobody had opened. And the coffee had been remade twice, and the second pot was already mostly gone. At 4:30, Evelyn went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been awake for 22 hours and had spent the last 6 of them writing a document that would change the legal landscape for everyone she had known in the previous decade of her life. There were shadows under her eyes that would not resolve with anything short of sleep she wasn't going to get, and her hair had done the specific thing it did when she'd been running on adrenaline for too long, escaping in ways that she had given up managing around 2 a.m. She thought about the dining room, the linen tablecloth, the ring. She thought about Lawrence Greer writing that she had signed everything without independent review. She turned off the tap. She went back to the conference room. The call to the U.S. Attorney's Office went through at 9:05 Thursday morning, and the meeting was set for 2 p.m. The same day, which Helen Marsh said was unusually fast, and told them something about how familiar the office already was with Blackwell Holdings. Evelyn didn't go home between the all-night session and the meeting. She went to a hotel 2 blocks from the federal building, showered, changed into the clothes Marcus had had his assistant bring from her apartment, ate something she couldn't remember immediately after eating it, and sat in the room for 40 minutes trying to make her mind go quiet. It wouldn't. It kept producing details. The 18th email, in which Holt had written to Greer, "If the Mercer woman becomes a problem, we have 14 months of signed instruments that tell a different story than whatever she'll claim." The particular past tense of that sentence, the Mercer woman, as if she had always been anticipated as a problem to be managed, rather than a person who existed independently of their calculations. She had been background to everyone for so long, to Damien, to Margaret, to Lawrence Greer, to Raymond Holt, something that held things up without being looked at directly. She was going to be very, very difficult to look past now. The federal building had security that took 7 minutes to clear, even with credentials, and the conference room on the 9th floor where the meeting took place had no windows and a table that was too large for the number of people in it, and fluorescent lighting that flattened everyone's faces to the same gray register. There were 4 people on the government side: the assistant U.S. attorney who ran the meeting, a junior attorney who took notes, and 2 investigators from the financial crimes unit who said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes and then asked extremely precise questions for the 40 minutes after that. Evelyn had Helen Marsh on her left and Marcus on her right, and Derek at the end of the table with the document chain printed and tabbed. She had her own copy of the statement of facts in front of her, though she didn't refer to it. She had read it enough times that it had become internal, part of the architecture of what she knew rather than something she needed to consult. The AUSA's name was Jonathan Reyes. He was 40, deliberate, with the particular quality of attention that federal prosecutors develop when they are genuinely interested in what someone has to say. He read the statement of facts while everyone waited. He read it without expression. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Mercer." "Ms. Mercer," she said, not with heat, simply as a fact. "Ms. Mercer, I want to start with the documents you signed 4 years ago in what you describe as your routine signing queue. Can you walk me through what that process looked like in practice? She walked him through it. Reyes asked follow-up questions, specific, technical, sometimes deceptively simple, in a way that she recognized as deliberate. And she answered each one with the same precision she had brought to the statement, neither adding detail she wasn't certain of, nor hedging on facts she knew clearly. Marcus had told her, in the elevator up, that her job in this room was not to prosecute anyone, not to perform outrage, not to make the case herself. Her job was to be a credible, specific, unimpeachable account of what she had known and when and how. She held that instruction throughout. At the 45-minute mark, one of the financial investigators, a woman named Patel, who had said nothing until this moment, leaned forward and said, "Ms. Mercer, Raymond Holt, what is the nature of your personal relationship with him?" "Professional acquaintance, board member. We spoke perhaps 6 times a year at board-adjacent events. Cordial but not close." "Did he ever discuss the subsidiary LLC structure with you?" "Never." "Did he discuss financial arrangements between Blackwell Holdings and outside entities?" "Not directly. He made general comments in board meeting contexts about the company's capital structure, but nothing specific to the instruments you're looking at." "Was there anything in your direct interactions with him that suggested awareness of documents you were signing?" Evelyn thought about this carefully, because careful was the only way to do it. "He asked me at a corporate dinner approximately 2.5 years ago whether I felt adequately informed about the company's financing arrangements." She paused. "I said I believed so. He said something along the lines of, 'The company benefits tremendously from your involvement, more than most people appreciate.' I thought it was a compliment. It registered as slightly odd phrasing, and I moved past it." Patel wrote something down. "Did you discuss that conversation with your husband?" "No." Reyes looked up. "Why not?" She thought about the honest answer and gave it. "Because Damien didn't discuss the business with me in any real depth. That was how our dynamic had settled. I managed financial structures. He managed the company's public presentation. There was a wall between those two functions that I had largely stopped trying to cross." The room was quiet. Reyes said, "Ms. Mercer, based on what you've brought us today, and pending our own investigation, I want to be direct with you about what we're looking at. The shell company instruments, the routing discrepancy, the email record. This is not a small matter. This will require a full forensic audit of Blackwell Holdings' financial records going back at minimum 5 years. That process is going to be disruptive and public." He looked at her steadily. "I want to ask you, and I want you to think about this before you answer. Is there anything at all in the material you've provided or in your own knowledge of Blackwell Holdings' operations that you are uncertain about or that could be characterized in a way you haven't anticipated?" She looked back at him with the same steadiness. "No." He nodded. He gathered the statement of facts and closed the folder. "We'll be in touch with your attorneys within 48 hours." The board meeting was not something Evelyn attended. Marcus attended with Derek and 2 associates, representing Evelyn's interests as the original guarantor of record for the company's legitimate lending arrangements. Gerald Kim was there for the existing Blackwell board. 3 independent directors who had been brought in at the lender's request were there along with Sandra Park from Meridian Capital. Raymond Holt received a request not to attend and complied, which Marcus said later was the first sign that Holt's own attorneys had advised him that the federal situation was moving faster than he'd anticipated. Damien was there. She heard about it afterward, in pieces, from Marcus and Derek, and unexpectedly, from Thomas, who called her that evening and said, "I need you to know I voted to support the restructuring plan. I thought you should hear it from me." She sat with that for a moment. Thomas, mild wine-drinking Thomas, who had said almost nothing useful in 8 years of family dinners, had apparently spent the 4-hour board meeting being one of 3 votes that carried the independent restructuring proposal over the version Damien's team had proposed, which would have kept Damien's executive authority nominally intact while making cosmetic changes to the board composition. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He said, "She kept us alive. It took me too long to say it out loud." She didn't say anything to that. She just said goodbye and set the phone down. Marcus's account of the board meeting came in 3 calls over the course of the evening, and she pieced it together the way you piece together a scene you weren't in, through the specific details that stuck to the people who were there, the things that mattered enough to be reported. Damien had walked into the boardroom knowing, for the first time, the approximate shape of what he was facing. His attorneys had briefed him. He knew about the DOJ disclosure. He knew about the shell company structure and about Holt's involvement and, in broad strokes, about the Greer emails. He had known enough to prepare something. Marcus said he had clearly been up all night, that there was a specific quality of over-rehearsed fluency in how he spoke that signaled preparation rather than genuine clarity. He had presented the case that he was a victim too, that Holt and Greer had operated beyond his knowledge, that the shell structure had been concealed from him as much as from Evelyn, that the company's path forward required his continued leadership because he was the only person who knew where all the pieces were. Sandra Park had asked him, quietly, who had authorized the subsidiary LLC formation. Damien had said the authorization had come through proper channels. Park had placed a document on the table, a single page, and said, "This is an authorization memo for the formation of Cascade Capital Partners, LLC, dated 3 years and 2 months ago. It bears your signature, not your operational team's signature, your signature in your capacity as CEO." She had pushed it toward him across the table. "Can you explain the circumstances under which you signed this?" Marcus said the room went very quiet. Damien had looked at the document. He had looked at it for a long time. And then he had said, in a voice that Marcus described as stripped of everything it usually contained, "I need to speak with my attorneys before I respond to that question." The board had recessed for 40 minutes. When they came back, Gerald Kim had indicated that Damien was prepared to accept a temporary leave of executive authority, pending independent audit completion, in exchange for the board's agreement to consider his position following the audit's conclusion. The board had accepted the proposal in name and rejected it in practice, passing the independent restructuring resolution by 6 votes to 3, which installed a temporary independent CEO drawn from the restructuring firm, accepted Evelyn's proposed financial recovery framework as the basis for stabilizing the lending arrangements, ordered a full forensic audit of all subsidiary relationships, and removed Raymond Holt's board seat pending legal proceedings. 6 votes to 3. Thomas had been one of the 6. Damien had voted against his own removal and lost. She was in her apartment when Marcus called with the final count. She was sitting on the floor. She still didn't have enough furniture, the kitchen table situation had not resolved, and sometimes the floor was simply where she ended up, with her back against the wall and her knees up and the phone on speaker between her feet. She listened to Marcus read the vote tally. She listened to him describe the final resolution. When he finished, the apartment was quiet. "Evelyn, I'm here. The forensic audit starts Monday. The DOJ contact has been made. Reyes's office is moving. This is going to take months to fully resolve, and there will be difficult days inside those months, but the direction is set." He paused. "You did this. I want to say that clearly." She looked at the ceiling. The apartment had a water stain in the corner that she'd noticed when she first looked at it and had decided she could live with. It had gotten slightly larger in the 6 weeks since she moved in. She kept meaning to report it. "The employees," she said. "The restructuring plan protects them. The recovery framework you built keeps the company viable. Layoffs are not guaranteed. The restructuring team will make operational decisions, but the financial foundation is stable enough that—" He stopped. "Yes, it protects them." She exhaled. She had not let herself feel the full weight of that particular thing until now. The 2,000 people who had jobs at a company she had helped build and could have destroyed, whose livelihoods had been the last piece of hesitation in every decision she'd made since Sunday. She had not let herself feel it because feeling it while making the decisions would have made the decisions harder, and the decisions needed to be made clearly. She felt it now. A few seconds of it, sitting on the floor of an apartment with too little furniture and a growing water stain, and then she folded it back. There was still a great deal left to do. "At 9 in the evening, Damien called. She answered. She didn't know exactly why she answered. Maybe because it was over enough now that the call felt different from the 6 calls on Sunday night. Those had been the calls of a man reaching for a lifeline. This was something else. She could tell from the first second by the quality of the silence before he spoke. "I'm not calling to ask you for anything," he said. She waited. He stopped. Started again. "Gerald told me what you built. The recovery framework. The lending stabilization structure. He walked me through it this afternoon, and Another stop. "I didn't know you could do that. I don't mean I didn't know you were smart enough. I mean, I never looked. I never. His voice did something she had not heard it do in a very long time. I never looked at what you were doing. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. You didn't. Evelyn, Damien. She said it gently. Not kindly, exactly, but without the hardness that the situation might have warranted and that she no longer had the energy to maintain. Don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Not tonight. He was silent. She heard his breathing. The company is going to survive, she said. The people who work there are going to be okay. You're going to face what's in front of you. I'm going to face what's in front of me. That's where we are. A long pause. Then, very quietly, I knew. About Holt. Not all of it. Not the shell companies. Not your... I didn't know that part. But I knew he was doing something I shouldn't look at too closely. And I looked away, and I told myself it wasn't my business. His voice was flat with the specific exhaustion of a person saying out loud something they've been refusing to say for a long time. That was my business. It was always my business. Evelyn sat with that. It was not enough. It was not even close to enough. But it was more honest than anything he had said to her in years, and she recognized it as such. I know, she said. I know you knew. She ended the call. She set the phone down. She put her head back against the wall and she looked at the ceiling and she breathed slowly until her chest felt less compressed. Outside, the city was doing what the city did. Constant, indifferent, carrying its millions of separate lives in separate rooms, each one with its own specific damage and its own specific effort toward mourning. And downstairs, in the lobby of the federal building 14 blocks south, a courier was signing for a package that had been sent by Webb, Hartley and Associates at 7:45 that evening. The full disclosure package, formally entered into record, the last piece of the foundation that Evelyn had spent 3 nights and 1 marriage building into position. The package was received. The clock was running. Raymond Holt's attorneys did not yet know what was coming, but by morning they would, and by morning everything would have changed in the way that things change when they are finally, irrevocably, moving in only one direction. Damien Blackwell sat in his car outside the building that used to be his and did not start the engine for a very long time. The forensic audit began on a Monday and did not finish until late November. Evelyn knew this in the abstract. She tracked it the way you track weather in a city you've left, checking the reports without being inside the rain. Marcus sent her weekly summaries. Derek flagged documents that required her review or clarification. Helen Marsh called twice in October with updates from the DOJ side that required specific responses, specific confirmations of specific facts, and each time Evelyn sat at the kitchen table she had finally bought, small, secondhand, scarred along one edge in a way she found she didn't mind, and answered every question with the same care she had brought to the statement of facts in September. The table had cost her $60 at an estate sale 3 blocks from her apartment. The woman running the sale had told her it had belonged to a retired school teacher who'd had it for 40 years. Evelyn had run her hand along the scarred edge and said she'd take it. She thought about that sometimes. 40 years of someone's meals and papers and morning coffee at a table that now lived in her kitchen. The particular continuity of objects that outlasted the people who used them, carrying the shape of daily life without caring whose daily life it was. She was building something daily. That was the best way she had found to describe the months between September and December. Not recovery exactly, because recovery implied returning to something, and she had no interest in returning anywhere. Building, slowly, with the specific attention of a person who had learned, at significant cost, what happens when you let other people determine the load-bearing structure of your life. Raymond Holt was indicted on a Thursday morning in late October, and Evelyn learned about it the way most people learn about things now. From her phone, a news alert, a headline that contained his name, and the words federal fraud charges in the same sentence. She read the alert twice. She set her phone face down on the table. She went back to the spreadsheet she'd been working on, which was the preliminary financial model for something she'd been building in the hours between everything else. And she worked on it for another 40 minutes before she let herself sit back and feel the full weight of what the headline meant. It meant the package they had walked into the federal building with in September had done what it was supposed to do. It meant Jonathan Reyes and his team had spent 6 weeks building the case that Evelyn and Marcus had handed them the bones of. and they had built it into something with enough structural integrity to support a federal indictment against a man who had spent 40 years accumulating the kind of institutional credibility that was supposed to make him untouchable. It meant Raymond Holt had looked at Evelyn Mercer for years as something he could use and had been wrong about what she was made of in a way that was going to cost him the rest of his professional life and possibly a significant portion of his freedom. She called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "You saw." "I saw." "Greer's deal is finalized. He cooperated fully. The government has everything." Brief pause. "He's looking at reduced charges. Nina's account was corroborating, but Greer's own cooperation made the difference." Evelyn thought about Nina Greer at the kitchen table in Park Slope, looking at the dead plants in the window box, saying she was only responsible for her own choices. "How is she?" Marcus paused. "She's filed for divorce. I know that from Helen. Nina reached out to Helen's firm for a referral." Evelyn absorbed that quietly. "Thank you for telling me." "Evelyn, the Damien situation..." He hesitated, which was rare enough that she paid close attention to it. "His attorneys reached out this morning. He's agreed to a full settlement. Everything you proposed in July through Gerald Kim. All of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why now?" "Because Holt's indictment names Damien as a knowing participant in the concealment structure. Not as a principal, the distinction matters, legally, but as someone who was informed, who was aware, and who made a deliberate decision not to investigate or report." Marcus said it carefully. "He is not being indicted, but his name is in the charging documents, and his attorneys know that the civil exposure from that, combined with the board's removal action, makes fighting the divorce settlement a losing position on every axis." "So he's not settling because he's sorry?" "No," Marcus said. "He's settling because he's out of moves." She had known that. She had expected it. And yet there was something in hearing it stated plainly. The confirmation that the resolution, when it came, would come not from any change in Damien, but from the exhaustion of his options. That settled in her chest with a particular weight that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The grief not for what had ended, but for the version of things she had once believed she was inside, before she knew the full shape of what she was actually in. "Schedule it," she said. "Whatever Marcus needs from me to close it, schedule it." The settlement meeting happened in the second week of November in a conference room that was neutral. Nobody's building, a temporary space in a midtown office suite that was rented by the hour for exactly these purposes. Beige walls, a round table, 6 chairs, a window that faced a brick wall. Damien was already there when Evelyn arrived. He was with Gerald Kim and another attorney she didn't know. He was wearing a suit she recognized, charcoal, fine wool, the kind he wore to meetings he considered important. He looked at her when she walked in with the specific expression of a man who has spent a long time preparing for an encounter and is now discovering that no amount of preparation actually makes it easier. He looked thinner, not dramatically. He was not a man who fell apart visibly. His vanity was too structural for that. But there was a particular quality of compression to him, something that had been removed from around the edges. She nodded at him. He nodded back. They sat on opposite sides of the round table, and the attorneys arranged themselves, and the documents were placed, and the process began. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. There were 7 distinct sections of the settlement agreement, and each one was reviewed, confirmed, occasionally adjusted on minor language points, and initialed. Evelyn read every word of every section, including the ones she had already reviewed, because she had learned the cost of signing things on trust, and she would not do it again. Not for any reason, not in any room. Damien watched her read. She was aware of this without looking at him. A peripheral awareness, the specific texture of someone's attention. At one point, on the 4th section, she found a clause that hadn't been in the draft she'd reviewed with Marcus, and she flagged it, quietly, without drama. Gerald Kim looked at his counterpart. There was a brief sidebar at the end of the table. The clause was removed. Nobody commented on this. They moved on. When the final page was signed, Marcus gathered the documents and the attorneys exchanged copies. Evelyn capped her pen. She looked at the table for a moment, the clean beige surface, the neat arrangement of executed pages. And then she looked up. Damien was looking at her. He said, "Can I have 2 minutes?" Gerald Kim looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Evelyn. "It's fine," she said. The attorneys stepped into the hallway. The door closed. The conference room was very quiet with just the two of them in it, the brick wall visible through the window behind Damien's shoulder, gray November light flattening everything. He said, "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started differently. "I've been trying to figure out what I owe you that isn't in those documents, and I can't make it into a number." She looked at him. "It's not a number." "No." He put his hands flat on the table, a gesture she recognized. She'd seen it in board meetings, the physical reset of a man trying to find solid ground. "I used you. Not consciously, not as a plan, but I used you because you were there, and you were capable, and it was easier than looking at what I was and wasn't doing myself." He looked at the table. "I told myself you were fine with it, that you were the kind of person who was fine with working in the background. I told myself that because it was convenient." She said, "You told yourself that because the alternative was having to see what it cost me, and seeing that would have required you to do something about it." He looked up. "You're not a stupid man, Damien. You knew what you were doing. You just decided it was acceptable." She said it without anger. The anger had been there. It had been there in the car on the way to the rest stop in September. It had been there reading Lawrence Greer's email at Nina's kitchen table. It had been there in the beige elevator of the federal building, pressing up through her chest at the specific moments when she had needed it not to show. But it was not here now, in this room, with these documents signed and this marriage formally and completely over. What was here was something much cooler and more permanent, the clear-eyed recognition of exactly who he was and exactly what that meant for every decision she had made and every decision she would make going forward. "I know," he said. "I know you know." She picked up her bag. She stood. "I hope you figure out who you are without the architecture I was holding up. I mean that without irony." She looked at him one last time, directly, the way she had looked at him across the dining table in September with the ring in her hand, but without the suppressed terror of that moment, without the 12 years of managed emotion. Just looking. "Take care of yourself." She walked to the door. She opened it. He said behind her, "Evelyn." She paused. "The company acknowledged—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "There's going to be a formal acknowledgement, in the restructuring communication, to the employees." His voice was careful in a way that cost him something. "About who actually kept it alive." She stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't turn around. "Good," she said. She walked out. The formal employee communication went out the first week of December, under the new interim CEO's name, as part of the quarterly restructuring update. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it stated, in straightforward language without euphemism, that Blackwell Holdings had survived a significant financial crisis that had revealed certain structural vulnerabilities in the company's governance and financial management. It stated that an independent investigation had confirmed that the company's financial stability over the preceding 8 years had been substantially supported by personal financial guarantees made by Evelyn Mercer, the former spouse of the founding CEO, and that the company was grateful for that contribution and acknowledged its employees' right to understand the history of the institution they worked for. 3 paragraphs. It took less than 2 minutes to read. Evelyn read it on her laptop at the scarred kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her second cup of coffee going cold beside her. She read it once. She closed the laptop. She sat for a while. 2,000 people were going to keep their jobs. The lending arrangements had been stabilized under the recovery framework she'd built in the apartment that didn't have enough furniture yet. The company was smaller than it had been. The audit and the restructuring had trimmed things, as audits and restructurings always did. But it was real. It was functioning. It was paying people's salaries and health insurance, and the particular ordinary things that meant someone could pay their own rent and buy their own kitchen table. She had not saved it for credit. She had never done anything for credit. But something about seeing the acknowledgement in plain language, in a document that 3,200 employees would read, something about that made her understand that the thing she had been carrying for 8 years was finally, formally set down. Other people knew its weight now. She didn't have to be the only one who knew. She got up and put her cold coffee in the microwave. She stood at the counter waiting for it to reheat, and she thought about what she was going to do today, specifically in the hours she had in front of her. She had a meeting at 2 with a woman named Josephine Clark, who was 37 and had been running a small logistics company out of a shared workspace in Queens for 4 years and needed capital and had been turned down by 3 conventional lenders for reasons that were technically procedural, and actually, in Evelyn's assessment, the result of a combination of unconscious bias and institutional risk aversion that had very little to do with the actual quality of Josephine Clark's business model. Evelyn had read Josephine's financials twice. They were sound. Better than sound. There was a specific kind of disciplined resourcefulness in how Josephine had managed her cash flow through 2 difficult quarters that Evelyn recognized, the way you recognize something in someone else that you know from the inside. The microwave beeped. She took her coffee and went back to the table and opened the laptop again, not to the Blackwell communication, but to the document she'd been building for 3 months, the one that had started as a spreadsheet and become something larger, a foundation structure, a board composition, an investment thesis, a set of criteria that she had written and rewritten until they said precisely what she meant. The Mercer Foundation for Women in Enterprise. Provisional name. She was still deciding whether to put her own name on it, whether that was the right call or an act of ego she'd regret. She'd been going back and forth on it for 6 weeks. Marcus thought she should. Helen Marsh, who had become unexpectedly friendly in the months since the DOJ disclosure, had said, "Your name is the point, Evelyn. Your name is what you're lending them, same as you lent it to Blackwell Holdings, except this time you're choosing." She thought about that. She thought about the school teacher's table and the 40 years of daily life it had carried without announcing itself. She opened the foundation document and worked until noon. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in early December, in a courtroom that was smaller than she'd imagined. Family court always was, she'd discovered, compressed and fluorescent, and smelling faintly of the fast food that the attorneys apparently ate at their desks between hearings. Her attorney, a woman Marcus had referred named Claire Osei, was beside her. Damien was not present. His attorney appeared on his behalf, which Claire had told her was common, and Evelyn had been quietly grateful for without examining the gratitude too closely. It took 11 minutes. The judge read the relevant sections, confirmed both parties had reviewed the settlement terms, asked Evelyn a handful of procedural questions directly, and signed. Evelyn Mercer, not Blackwell. The name she'd been born with and had carried alongside his for 8 years, and was now carrying again alone, which was different from before she was discovering. When you'd carried something alongside someone else and then carried it alone again, it had a different texture, not lighter, not heavier, just specifically yours in a way it hadn't been when you were 26, and it was simply the name you'd been given. Claire said something kind and efficient outside the courtroom. Evelyn thanked her. They parted ways at the elevator bank. She took the subway back uptown. This was new. She had started taking the subway in October, after years of car services and the particular corporate insulation of never being in contact with the actual city. She had rediscovered that she liked it. The specific democracy of it, everyone going somewhere, nobody aware of or interested in anyone else's complicated situation, the train moving through the dark tunnels with its own indifferent momentum. She had her earbuds in, but she wasn't listening to anything. She was watching the people across from her, a teenage boy asleep against the window with his backpack on his lap, a woman in scrubs reading something on her phone with the focused expression of someone using every spare minute, an older man in a good coat who was staring at the middle distance with the calm of someone who had been riding this train for decades and had made peace with every stop. At her stop, she got off and walked the 4 blocks home in the December cold, hands in her coat pockets, breath visible, the particular gray-gold light of late afternoon in the city that she had always loved even when she hadn't let herself notice it. The meeting with Josephine Clark was at 2, at a coffee shop that Josephine had suggested, not the one Evelyn had been sitting in when Marcus called her in September, a different one, further uptown, the kind with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu board, and the specific ambient noise of a place that was genuinely, rather than performatively casual. Josephine was already there. She was exactly what her financial documents had suggested. Compact, alert, the kind of person whose attention was fully on whatever was directly in front of them. She stood up when Evelyn came in, and they shook hands, and Josephine said, "Thank you for coming. I know this is... I want to say up front that I've done my research and I know who you are, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Evelyn sat down. "I know you have. That's fine. I read about the Blackwell situation. Most people have. I'm not interested in it as a story, Josephine said, and the directness of it landed cleanly. I mean, I'm not meeting you because of what happened to you. I'm meeting you because of what you built. The financial recovery structure. I read what they published about it in the restructuring report. She leaned forward slightly. That was a real thing. That was serious work. Something in Evelyn's chest settled, slightly, the way a structural thing settles when the load is properly placed. Tell me about your Q3 cash management decision, Evelyn said. The one where you deferred the equipment upgrade. Josephine blinked. You read that far into the financials? I read all of it. Josephine looked at her for a moment, and then she began talking. She talked about Q3 the way someone talks about a decision that had cost them sleep. Not proudly, not with false confidence, but with the specific texture of someone who had weighed a bad option against a worse option and made the call and lived with it and would make the same call again. She talked about the cash flow forecasting she'd done, the vendor relationship she'd managed to maintain through a payment delay that could have gone the other way, the single subcontract that had saved the quarter. Evelyn listened. She asked 3 questions. The questions were technical, specific, the kind that didn't have comfortable answers. They required Josephine to demonstrate either that she understood the structural risk in her own model or that she understood it. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. The coffee got cold. Neither of them noticed. When they were finished, Josephine said, "So, what happens now?" Evelyn said, "I'm going to send you a term sheet. It'll take me about a week. Read it carefully, have your own attorney review it, come back to me with questions. Don't say yes to anything you don't fully understand." Josephine was quiet for a moment. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about financial documents." She picked up her bag. "One thing, the term sheet will include a provision that you come back to us in the 3rd year with your own candidate, someone you think deserves the same consideration you're getting, who's being overlooked for the same reasons. Not mandatory, but preferred." Josephine looked at her. "Why?" Evelyn pulled on her coat. "Because I was invisible for 8 years and it cost me a great deal. And I'd like to be in the business of making sure that costs fewer people less." She said it without grandeur, without the particular emphasis that would have made it a speech. She said it the way she said things when she meant them, flatly, factually, as something that simply was. Josephine nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Okay, so." December settled into its particular rhythm, cold and bright in the mornings, dark by 4:30, the city accelerating toward the end of the year with its characteristic combination of exhaustion and momentum. Evelyn worked. She built the foundation structure with the same attention she had once given to the lending arrangements of a company that had not belonged to her, except that this belonged to her completely. The thesis, the criteria, the board she was beginning to assemble, the first round of candidates she was reviewing. She had dinner with Marcus in mid-December, not a meeting but an actual dinner, which they had never done before in 8 weeks of intensive professional crisis, and discovered that he was funny in a dry, understated way she hadn't anticipated, and that he had opinions about wine that were wrong, but that he held with a confidence she found entertaining. She had coffee twice with Helen Marsh, who turned out to have a daughter who played competitive chess, and a habit of finishing sentences she'd started in her head, and then correcting for the missing context halfway through, which Evelyn found oddly reassuring about the general state of human communication. She called Thomas once, briefly, to confirm a question about the original Blackwell board composition that she needed for a document. He answered immediately and gave her what she needed and then said, very quickly, as if he'd been holding it, "She should have told you we were glad you were in the family. I should have." Evelyn said she appreciated it, and she meant that. And then she said goodbye because the conversation had said what it needed to say, and extending it would have turned it into something else. She did not call Margaret. Margaret sent a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, on the cream stationery she had always used, that arrived in the 2nd week of December, and that Evelyn read at the kitchen table, and then sat down and left there for 3 days before she decided what to do with it. The letter was formal and brief, and in it Margaret said, without the decorative language she usually deployed, that she had been wrong about what Evelyn was, and wrong about what she was worth, and that she was not asking for anything in return for saying so, only that she had wanted to say it while she was certain enough of the fact to commit it to paper. Evelyn wrote back. 2 sentences. "I received your letter. I believe you." She sealed it and put it in the mail and did not revisit it. On a Friday evening in late December, she walked through the city. No particular destination. She did this sometimes now. Started walking and let the route be determined by the lights and the cold and whatever was in front of her. She had grown up in this city, in a different borough, a different version of what the city was. And she had spent 8 years in the insulated professional geography of someone whose life moved between specific coordinates, office building, corporate event, mansion in Westchester, without touching the actual texture of the place. She walked east on 57th and then turned south without planning to and kept going, past the department stores with their window displays, and the restaurants beginning to fill with the early dinner crowd, and the street vendors packing up against the cold, past a playground that was empty, and a bodega that was full, and a bus stop where 3 people stood in the particular patient stillness of people who had calculated that the bus was coming soon enough that it wasn't worth doing anything else. She stopped at a corner she didn't have a reason to stop at. The light was red. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and the city doing its thing in every direction. Continuous, indifferent, carrying its millions of separate stories without prioritizing any of them. She was 41 years old. She had spent 8 years being the architecture of something that other people got credit for. She had been used as a wall, a guarantee, a legal shield, a background figure, a convenient invisibility. She had signed her name to things that had been described to her falsely, trusted people who had mapped out her vulnerability before she'd known it existed, absorbed a decade of quiet diminishment, and called it equilibrium. She had also built a financial recovery structure that kept 2,000 people employed. She had walked into a federal building with 23 emails and her own statement of facts and changed the legal landscape for everyone who had tried to make her the one holding the bag. She had sat across from a federal prosecutor and answered every question with precision and never needed to be corrected on a single fact. She was building a foundation on a second-hand table with a scarred edge, and next week she was sending Josephine Clark a term sheet, and there were 11 other files open on her laptop of women in similar positions, and the board she was assembling had 3 confirmed members and 2 more in conversation. The light changed. She crossed the street with everyone else. The city kept moving. She kept moving with it, not restored to something she had been before, not returned from somewhere she had gone, but present, specifically and completely present, in the life she was building out of the materials she actually had, which were considerable, and which she had stopped pretending to be modest about, because modesty had cost her enough, and she was done paying that particular price. She walked another 6 blocks, and then she found a coffee shop she hadn't been to before. And she went in out of the cold and ordered something and sat at the window and watched the street. She had her notebook with her. She opened it to a blank page. At the top she wrote, Year 1, what it needs to do. She thought for a moment, watching a cab make a slow turn through the intersection, watching a woman in a red coat walk fast with her head down against the wind, watching the city be exactly itself. Then she began to write. The pen moved steadily. The page filled. Outside the window, the light changed and changed again, and the street kept turning over its steady inventory of lives going somewhere. And Evelyn Mercer, not Blackwell, not anyone's guarantee, not the invisible architecture of someone else's empire, wrote until she had said everything she needed to say for now. And then she closed the notebook, finished her coffee, put on her coat, and walked back out into the cold and the noise and the ongoing particular life of the city she had always lived in and was only now, at 41, beginning to actually inhabit. The foundation had a name by morning. She had decided her name, because it was hers, because she had earned it back, every syllable, in ways she would not minimize by hiding it. Because the women she was going to fund deserved to know that the person behind the money had once been exactly where they were, overlooked, underestimated, carrying more than anyone saw, waiting for someone to look directly at what they were worth. No one was going to look for them. She knew that now with the certainty of first-hand knowledge, so she was going to be the one who looked. January came in cold and indifferent the way January always does in New York, stripping the last decorative softness off the city and leaving it in its actual state, gray, functional, moving, because stopping was not an option. Evelyn was at her desk by 7:30 most mornings. Not the apartment's kitchen table, which remained the place for coffee and notebooks and the slower thinking, but the office she had signed a lease on in the second week of January, 2 rooms and a reception area on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that was neither prestigious nor shabby, chosen because the light was good and the lease was reasonable, and the building manager had not asked her a single question she found condescending. She had furnished it herself over 3 weekends with the same deliberate attention she'd given the apartment. Nothing excessive, nothing performing importance, everything chosen because it worked. The Mercer Foundation for Women in Enterprise opened its doors, formally, on the 15th of January. There was no event, no ribbon, no press release, because she was not ready for the press, and the press was not yet sure what to make of her, which suited her fine. There was only the morning she arrived at the office and turned the lights on and sat at her desk and opened her laptop and sent Josephine Clark the finalized term sheet with a cover note that said, "Read everything. Call me with questions. Take the week." Josephine called that afternoon. She had 3 questions. They were good questions, specific, structural, the kind that demonstrated she had read every word rather than skimming for the number. Evelyn answered each one. At the end of the call, Josephine said, "I'm going to sign this." "Take the week," Evelyn said again. Josephine laughed, short, real. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to take my business seriously. I don't need a week." A pause. "But I'll take it because you're right that I should." She signed at the end of the week. She was the foundation's first investment. She would not be the last. Lawrence Greer pleaded guilty in February. Evelyn read the court filing on a Tuesday afternoon between 2 phone calls, the same way she'd read the Holt indictment in October, briefly, factually, setting the phone face down when she was done. The plea included full cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation, a detailed account of the document routing scheme, and a formal allocution confirming that Evelyn Mercer had not known the nature of the instrument she was signing. That last part mattered more than she'd expected it to. Not legally. Marcus had already established her position as witness rather than subject months ago, and there had been no serious ambiguity about that for some time. But something about seeing it stated in a legal document, a man under oath in a federal courtroom confirming that she had not known, that she had been used and had not participated, something about that settled a thing she hadn't fully realized was still unsettled. She had known her own innocence the entire time. Knowing it and having it confirmed on the public record turned out to be 2 different experiences. She forwarded the filing to Marcus with no comment. He replied, "Clean, completely clean." Then after a pause, "You should feel good about this." She wrote back, "Working on it." It was the most honest thing she could have said. Raymond Holt's trial was set for the following autumn, which meant it was months away and out of her daily field of view, which was how she preferred it. She had given her witness statement. She would testify if called. In the meantime, she had 11 other files open on her laptop and a board meeting scheduled for the end of February. And Josephine Clark had sent her a quarterly update that was, by any honest reading, ahead of projection. She was not spending her energy on Raymond Holt. Raymond Holt had spent enough of her energy already, without asking. So, Marcus called on a Thursday in March. He said, "Damien's been offered a settlement by the DOJ on the civil side. Substantial financial penalties. He's going to take it." She was standing at the window of the office, watching the street below. Criminal exposure? None. The civil settlement closes that door. His cooperation on the Holt prosecution bought him the outcome his attorneys were working toward. Brief pause. He's leaving New York. She hadn't expected that. Where? I heard Connecticut. Somewhere quiet. Marcus's voice was neutral, reporting facts. His brother's helping him. She thought about Thomas, mild Thomas with his Thursday afternoon wine, who had voted the right way at the board meeting and called her afterward and said the thing he should have said earlier. She was glad Thomas was helping. Damien was going to need someone to help him, and Thomas was steady in ways that didn't announce themselves. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "There's one more thing." Marcus said it carefully. He asked, through Gerald, so it's at arm's length, whether you would be willing to receive a letter from him, not expecting a response, just a letter. The street below was doing its ordinary Thursday thing. A delivery truck double-parked. 2 people arguing amiably on the corner about something she couldn't hear through the glass. A woman pushing a stroller with one hand and eating something with the other. The particular focused multitasking of someone operating on not enough sleep. "Yes," she said. "He can send a letter." Marcus said okay, and moved on to the next item on his list, which was the foundation's tax structure, and she turned from the window and sat back down at her desk, and they worked through it together for the next 40 minutes. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was handwritten, which surprised her. Damien had always typed everything, had a particular impatience with handwriting that she'd attributed to the fact that his was poor. This was careful, full, deliberate. 3 pages on plain white paper. She read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee that was still hot. He did not ask for forgiveness. She had braced for that, the request dressed as an offering. And it didn't come. What came instead was an account. The specific account of a man looking back at 8 years and naming, one by one, the moments when he had known something and chosen not to act on it. The dinner where she'd come home at midnight from managing a financial crisis he hadn't known about because he hadn't asked. The quarterly review where she'd flagged a discrepancy in the lending structure and he'd told her the legal team had it handled. The Sunday 3 years ago when she'd sat across from him at breakfast and said quietly that she was tired and he had said of what, and she had said of all of it, and he had said, "You just need a vacation," and moved on. He wrote about these moments with the specific clarity of someone who had spent months reconstructing a history they'd previously been able to avoid examining. It was not comfortable to read. It was not supposed to be. At the end of the 3rd page, he wrote, "You asked me once, early on, whether I saw you. I told you I did. I believed it when I said it, which is the most honest thing I know how to tell you. I didn't know then that seeing and looking were different. I know now. I'm sorry it took losing everything to teach me that. I think you deserved someone who understood it without the lesson." She read that last paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and set it on the table. She sat with her coffee in the Sunday quiet of the apartment and the bare branch tree visible through the window, just beginning, in the March cold, to show the first tentative signs of something coming back. She did not write back. She had said she wouldn't expect a response, and she honored that. Not because she had nothing to say, but because some things were complete at one end and didn't require completion at the other. She had received the letter. She had understood it. She was setting it down. She made more coffee and went back to work. Spring came the way spring comes to New York. Not gently, not gradually, but in decisive lurches, a warm week followed by 2 cold ones. The trees confused and determined in equal measure, the city shedding its winter compression and expanding back into itself. By April, the foundation had made 4 investments. Josephine Clark's logistics company had hired 2 additional employees, which Josephine reported in a quarterly update that was 3 paragraphs of numbers and 1 paragraph saying, plainly, that she had not understood what it would feel like to have a financial partner who read her documents as carefully as she did. Evelyn read that last paragraph and felt something move in her chest that she was learning to simply call satisfaction rather than examining it for flaws. The board had 5 members now, 3 women, 2 men, all with specific expertise she'd chosen for rather than prestige. They met monthly. They argued about the criteria, good arguments, the kind that sharpened rather than muddied. And they made decisions that Evelyn brought to the table with her full analysis and then subjected to the board's disagreement, because she had learned the cost of unchallenged authority, and she did not intend to replicate it. Marcus came to the 2nd board meeting as a legal advisor, and afterward they had dinner at a place neither of them had been, and he said the board dynamic was the healthiest he'd seen in a governance structure in a long time. She said she wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an indictment of corporate governance generally. He said probably both. She laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her slightly, the way real laughter sometimes did when it arrived without being managed. She had been laughing more, not performing ease, genuinely finding things funny, genuinely finding things worth the energy. It was new. Or it was old, something that had been compressed for a long time, returning to its natural shape. In May, the Blackwell Holdings restructuring issued its annual report for the first time under the new leadership. There was a section, 3 paragraphs, in the opening letter from the interim CEO that addressed the company's recent history directly. It named the financial recovery framework by its technical designation and noted that it had been developed by Evelyn Mercer in her capacity as the original guarantor of record. It noted that without the voluntary disclosure that had initiated the DOJ investigation, the fraudulent shell company structure might have remained concealed long enough to cause irreparable harm to the company's 2,300 employees. It noted, in the final sentence of the section, that the company's survival was in material part a consequence of decisions made by someone who had no obligation to make them and who made them anyway. The report was public. It was read by investors and analysts and journalists and the 3,200 employees who received it in their inboxes on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn read it at her desk. She read the 3 paragraphs twice. She looked at the last sentence for a long time. No obligation, and who made them anyway? She thought about the dining room on a Sunday in September, the ring on the white linen, the 7 words she'd said. She thought about the rest stop on the Hutchinson, 12 minutes with her forehead against the steering wheel. She thought about Nina Greer's kitchen table and the dead plants in the window box, and 23 emails that had mapped the architecture of a plan designed to destroy her. She thought about the federal building's beige elevator and Jonathan Reyes's eyes tracking every word she said. She thought about what it had cost, the specific, real cost of it, not abstractly, but the texture of it, the nights, the fear beneath the composure, the particular loneliness of being the one who saw clearly while others chose not to, the 8 years of breakfast and board meetings and Sunday lunches that had all been, in their way, preparation for something she hadn't known was coming. She had paid everything she'd been asked to pay, and then she had paid more, and chosen it, because the alternative was letting something wrong stand. She closed the report. She opened the next file on her list. A woman named Grace Oduya, 44, running a healthcare logistics consultancy in Newark. 3 years of solid financials and 2 rejections from conventional lenders, both citing insufficient collateral, which was the kind of reasoning that looked like risk management and was actually something else. Evelyn read the financials. She picked up her pen. She began making notes in the margin. On a Thursday evening in June, she walked through the park. Not for any reason. She walked because it was warm and the light was long and the city had that particular early summer quality of believing, briefly, that everything difficult was behind it, which was not true and never lasted and was still, for the duration it held, worth being inside. She walked without her phone. She had started doing this, leaving it in her bag, actually in her bag, not in her hand, and found that the city looked different when you weren't partially somewhere else. More detailed, more insistently itself. There were children on the grass near the path, an older couple on a bench, not talking, sitting with the specific ease of people who had been talking for 40 years and had made peace with the silences. A man jogging past with the particular facial expression of someone running not for joy, but because they'd committed to it and were seeing it through. Dogs in their various negotiations with each other and with their humans. All of it ordinary and continuous and entirely unconcerned with her. She sat down on a bench near the reservoir and watched the water. The evening light was doing something to the surface, turning it a color that didn't have a simple name, something between gold and gray, moving with the slight wind. She was 41 years old. She had a foundation with 4 investments and a 5th in final review. She had a board that argued with her productively. She had a second-hand table with a scarred edge and an office with good light and a water stain in her apartment ceiling that she had finally reported and that was now officially someone else's problem. She had her name, just her name. Hers. She sat with the water for a while. She was not finished. There was a great deal still to do, more than she could map from here, and some of it would be hard in ways she couldn't anticipate, and she would make mistakes inside it. She knew that now with the specific humility of someone who had paid for the mistake of believing she wouldn't. She would get things wrong. She would correct them. She would keep going. But right now, on this bench, in this light, with the water moving and the city breathing around her and the long summer evening still ahead, right now she was simply here. Present in the specific life she had built from what remained after everything else had been taken or given away or walked out of. She had started with a ring on a white tablecloth and 7 words and a thick envelope she had been carrying for months against the moment she would need it. She had the rest now. She stood up. She walked back out of the park into the warm evening noise of the city, and she went home, and she made dinner, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour, and in the morning she got up and went to work. That was the whole of it.